There
So
we go.
before I get into the presentation, I thought it might be helpful for some people who want to do a little bit more in-depth research to show some of the literature that I've based this presentation on. So there's a 3-set volume of books called Holy Scripture, Ground and Pillar of Our Faith. It's a biblical defense of the Reformation principle of sola scriptura. So it goes into a great deal of depth in terms of, can we rely on the scriptures, and is it valid to say that we should use the scripture as our sole or as our final authority? It's not necessarily our sole authority, because that's not exactly what it says. It's the final authority. And can we rely on the scripture? And there's a 3-volume set. 1 volume alone just goes into what the early church fathers had to say about this. And the other 2 are on all the different range of topics, some of which we will breach today. The second book, which I think was very helpful, it helped me a great deal, is this book here by a guy called James White. He's a scholar. And in this book, he answers a lot of controversial questions in terms of the modern translations. And in the process of answering these questions about, and this is about the controversy that some people say that the King James Bible is the only trustworthy English translation of the New Testament and the Old, but this is predominantly about the New Testament. And in that book, he actually goes into a great detail of depth of how the transmission of the New Testament text actually took place. So despite of learning about being able to answer whether you can trust modern translations, it also basically gives you a roundup of why you can actually trust the New Testament altogether. And finally, another book that I think is very fascinating, which we will touch on later, I'm just going to point it up here, it's called Hidden in Plain View. It's about the undesigned coincidences in the Gospels and Acts. And this is written by an analytic philosopher, a rather nerdy lady. If you ever get the chance to listen to her, you'll be fascinating. She's absolutely stunningly interesting to listen to. And you will see there are things hidden in the Gospels and Acts, historical bits of information that we generally tend to read over, that lend credibility to the book itself in ways that are just quite remarkable. And they help and underpin the reliability of the text itself. But we will get into that a bit later. So Phil, if you want to just chuck up the slides there, then we can get going. I think you need me and the slides.
Sorry, Steve. I'm working on clicking these fancy buttons here.
So at the moment
Yeah, why am I doing that? I want you, and I want your slides.
There you go. That's it.
Start with that.
Here we
see
go.
if I can remove me.
Okay. So the basic question we're attempting to answer today is, how reliable is the New Testament? And we're going to look at some of the objections that are raised, that are fairly common objections. And of course, this is a roundup summary. So in this 45-minute session, I'm only going to be able to give you some detail. And in the end, I think what's important is that you go and do your own research and go and follow up. But you should walk away feeling rather confident about the New Testament. That's my aim. So as a roundup, what I want you to know and remember, and it is, number one, I don't want you to frantically try and remember all the facts, because that's not what it's about. I can't remember them all up either. What I want you to do is recognize that there are valid objections, and we're not going to aim to minimize the objections, because that's not helpful, and that doesn't help you or the person who's raising the objections. But I do want you to walk away feeling confident that the New Testament is actually the most attested book of antiquity. Sorry, I just noticed there's a spelling error there. And so it's a book you can base your Christian worldview on in a rational, reliable sense. So you're not asked to blindly believe, because that's a very common thing that Christians are attacked with, I suppose, is that all we do is just blindly believe some book, and that's just simply not true. So why does it, why do we need to even concern ourselves with this question? And some people, raise this question because for them, it doesn't really matter. Well, and I would say it actually does. And I'm going to give you just one little example, but just briefly to mention that the objections that are raised against the New Testament are of a very broad category, and I'm not going to deal with wild accusations existing, such as the first century Christians believed in reincarnation, and by the second century the copy process had edited reincarnation out of the New Testament. That is a completely unfounded, unhistorical, silly accusation that's just not based on any kind of data whatsoever. So we're not going to be dealing with those types of questions. But this question here is a valid question. It's one that's been raised in a recent Hollywood movie, and as you can see from the comment there, one of the actors sort of says, "Oh, it was just a basic sexist kind of idea that the Gospel of Mary was removed in the first century." But as you can see, if you follow through the details on this slide, there is valid historical data and reasons why the early church did not include this book into the canon of the New Testament. And that has been reviewed and revised and relooked at in our modern day as well. And there is still, so for the last 2,000 years, there's never been a good historical and theological reason why we should include that book. And of course, this data that we've got enables us to do precisely this kind of analysis. So that's one of many reasons why it is important to know how the documents of the New Testament were transmitted. Now, just as a side, it is important, and I think this is a generic comment here, that it is important not to burn down straw men. In other words, this idea that you put up a superficially simplified version of somebody's argument, and then you destroy that superficially simplified version and walk away victorious, and it looks like your position won the day, but in reality, all you did was, as this slide says, you burnt down the straw man. So we're not going to do that. We're actually going to have a look at the serious data that people raise in terms of the objection, and then see where that will take us. So this is the onslaught of the skeptics as such. So what they say is that we have copies of copies of copies of copies of copies, and actually you could keep going there for quite a while. So we're talking about until the printing press was invented in 1600 something, the early 1600s. I think it was around 1630, by a chap called Gutenberg in Germany. So you have 1,500 years of hand copying the text of the New Testament. So you literally have copies of copies of copies, a very long trail. And so in this setup, we have 400,000 variants in the New Testament text. Now that sounds like a crazily large number, and we'll give some if you like, context around that number shortly. But right now, we're just dealing with the fact this is what the skeptics are saying. We have roughly 138,000 words in the New Testament, 138,162 to be precise. This is in the Greek New Testament that underlies our versions in the English and language and the various other translations in the world. So which would mean that we have 3 variants for every word of the New Testament text. Now, when I talk about a variant, I'm talking about errors such as commas missing, punctuation, an added word, a taken away word, a spelling error, pluralization of a word that should be singular, and vice versa. All those kind of errors, copy errors. So the allegation is that we have 3 errors for every word in the New Testament. So, of course, the question is, how on earth can we be confident about the text? Because, looking at if this is all the information you had, this does not look good. But here's what they don't say, and this is the important context around these numbers that we just looked at. So you have 99% of the variants do not impact meaning. That's really important. So clearly, I'm not suggesting that commas do or don't impact meaning. They do. But nonetheless, 99% of variants do not change the meaning of the text. Most of the variants are, as I said, word order or spelling. 1% of them, roughly, are meaningful, important ones that need to have thorough research into each individual one, which of course that means we're down to 4,000 variants at this point. And this is one meaningful variant per 3 pages, but it's important to recognize here that this is not talking about the pages in terms of you opening the New Testament and that's each page is a page in this terminology. As we will see shortly, we have a wealth of manuscript data, thousands of them. We'll come to those figures in a minute. So it's for every page of manuscript data, we have one meaningful variant per 3 pages of those. It'll come together as we go through this information. So in the end, once we discount the most common scribal errors, we get to roughly 1,500 to 2,000 in the New Testament, which is a largely different figure than 400,000. And important here is to understand that the more manuscripts we have, the more variants we have. The less manuscripts, naturally, the less variants. But of course, that also means we have a smaller body of evidence to prove what is right. So the actual fact is that it is great that we have this very large body of evidence because it enables us to do good research and to figure out what should be there and what shouldn't be there. Now, if you, as an example, compare this to the transmission of the Quran, the Quran does not have any of this kind of textual history. Very early in the transmission of the Quranic text, the people who had the power and control over the transmission of it were so worried about that it would be changed that they effectively came together and destroyed all of the copies. So they're left with only a very small number. And of course, they today can't be certain that what they've got is actually what the original stated. So the New Testament is absolutely unique in this regard. So the cataloged manuscript data, and a summary of the data that we've got, is that today we have roughly 5,780. The reason why I'm saying roughly is because that literally month by month changes. We've been finding new manuscripts over the last 200 years, and even in the last few years, we've found more. So we have roughly just under 6,000 cataloged manuscripts, and the average length of these are around 200 pages. So some are just literally 1 or 2 verses, and some are the entire New Testament. So there's a broad range there. But importantly, the sum total of all the manuscripts that we have are roughly 1.3 million pages of handwriting. So when you then look at the fact that we then have 2,000 variants over 1.3 million pages of text over 1,500 years in terms of the manual transmission, copying handwritten text, then all of a sudden this doesn't look negative. It actually looks vastly positive. It looks like a miracle of providence. In other words, God used fallible human beings and protected his word in ways that are just absolutely stunning. Just a little bit of interesting sideline information is people who do this kind of research, they have fed all that into a computer program that then color codes the different texts of the New Testament based on the number of variants that exist. And it's kind of not surprising that the largest number of variants exist in the book of Revelation. And when you think of the kind of words that are used and the kind of stories and the kind of images that are used in that book, it is not hard to see how people would make mistakes with that, more so than in other books. And then the least one that literally has no variance in it is the book of Hebrews. So it's just sort of a little bit of a spectrum to see. So let's have a quick look at a typical scribal error. It's important to understand that the very early transmission of the New Testament text took place in what's called uncials. And an uncial is just a form of writing Greek language. And basically, it entails writing in all capitals no punctuation, and all the common words are abbreviated with the first and last letter and a little line along the top to denounce, to state basically that that was an abbreviation. So imagine you're at school and you have to write an essay, and you have to write that essay in all capitals and no punctuation. Great for people who struggle to place commas and full stops in the right places. And the simple reason for this is, of course, understanding that this needed to be done quickly. It needed to be done on very early, difficult transmission types such as papyri, which didn't last very long. And often these were written under persecution, at candlelight, late at night, in difficult circumstances. So of course it makes sense to condense this in ways that are making it easier to transmit the text. And so we're looking here at an example, and this, by the way, took place for the first up to 800 years. This is how the text was transmitted. Now we're looking at an example of what's called a homotelioton, which is just a fancy word for saying that it has a common, words with a similar ending are missing. And so if you look at these three lines and you look at the middle line to the furthest to the right, you see that it looks like the English word men. And then if you look at the word to the third line furthest to the left, and you see that that word also ends in the word men. And you can see sort of how that can happen is that the copyist basically is copying and reading, and then he's looking at the text and he's copying, and his mind jumps from one word to the next word that has a similar ending, and he misses out the previous word. And this is how the variant turns up that a word is missing. Now, if we only had one copy of 1 John, then that would be a serious problem because we wouldn't know. But of course, we have many, and therefore it is relatively easy to figure out which one is the right one. So that's just one example. And this slide gives you a little bit of a summary overview of how that process basically takes place. Don't forget, translations are done by large committees of people. I believe the King James Bible had a committee of nearly 400 people. They weren't all translators. There were all sorts of administrators in there as well. Most of the modern translations have been done by large committees of very intelligent, PhD-educated historians, scribes, scholars of all sorts of types of backgrounds, Greek and Hebrew experts, etc. And so what they will do is they'll look at all the different variant sets, look at the data that supports the different variants, and will categorize them into from A to D, A being the most certain, dependent on numbers and various different other factors. And the number D, as you can see, doesn't even appear in this particular example, but the number D basically is very, very rare. And so the items of C particularly is these ones you will find sometimes when you're reading, let's say you're reading in an NIV, and you will see a comment that's possibly in small writing in the center column of your text that says this word is missing in certain variants, and therefore we're not sure whether we put it in or we didn't put it in, so we added it in as a side note to the text so that you have the option to see, just because the translators weren't entirely certain. But just to reiterate, this is very rare, but nonetheless this does occur. So then this is just a little bit of information on how the distribution of the manuscripts, as in the distribution of data. So the top here, you have the year century 2 all the way to the 16th century. And of course, as you're getting further down the track, you see that the volume of data increases because, of course, the church has grown. The church came out of the early periods of persecution. Also, the method of transmission is on materials that are more durable than, of course, less likely to fade or be destroyed over time. And so, of course, we have a lot more data that's closer to our time period and a lot less data of the earlier church. But that also doesn't necessarily mean that we should give more weight to the later ones than to the earlier ones, because that's that's not what this is all about. We, of course, in the last 200 years have found many very early documents that simply weren't available, let's say, in the 16th century when the first major European language translations were made. So the weighting is done by number, by various different measures, by east and west, by majority text. Well, the majority text is really the the Eastern Byzantine tradition, as if we were to go back to this manuscript distribution, the darker lines at the top are predominantly in the Byzantine tradition, which is what you see at the bottom graph. And traditionally, the King James Bible, as an example, was translated predominantly by this textual tradition. But the reason for that is simply that the Alexandrian textual documents were not available to them. Most of these have only been found in the last 200 years. And of course, they have given us access to a lot more very early documents of the New Testament, and have enabled, therefore, textual revisions to be made that just simply make the text more accurate. They have not changed any of the important doctrines of the New Testament. So we're not talking about major changes. We're talking about minor additions and revisions. So how does the text transmission actually occur? Well, you could think of a phone game, and I'm sure most of you will have done this as a child at some point, where you transmit a little bit of information and you pass it on to the next person. You whisper it in their ear, and they whisper it into the next person's ear, and it doesn't take long before that information is completely destroyed and completely changed. And the thing is that unlike the Old Testament tradition that had a very strict scribal, if you like, tradition, in a sense that it was only the Jews transmitting the text, it was only done in certain places, and these were highly educated and very strictly controlled people, and organized, and in an organized manner, if you like. Whereas the text of the New Testament was transmitted very differently, because the church spread very rapidly and all over the known world at that stage, and copies were being transmitted in a kind of multi-line transmission. We'll look at this in this little graph here to understand what I mean by that. So if comparing that to the traditional telephone game, of course, if you have one change, the message is lost. If you have a multifocal, multi-regional transmission, then of course, if one change is entered into the text somewhere, you still have many, many others to compare that can confirm that that change was an actual erroneous change. And it's important that we have nearly 6,000 early manuscripts, and they weren't just from one location. They're from all over the known Roman world, and of course from all different time periods. So we have a mountain of data to work with. And this is just a very quick view of just what was going on in the spreading of the church very early on. As you can see, this is not a single line, one transmission, and it is not that the transmission of the New Testament was happening at one central location. So despite all of these allegations of corruptions of the text, we see that the distribution of the New Testament was widespread. It took place within the 200 years of all over the known world. And when I say known world, I mean the Greek and Roman world at that stage. And interestingly, many of the earliest documents that we have actually only been found in the last 100 years. So we have a very large volume of Greek manuscripts. And even if we lost all of these Greek manuscripts, let's say we didn't have any of those, we have 20,000 roughly early translations into the first century common languages that could be used to reconstruct the entire New Testament. And even if we lost all of those, we have also the quotes from the early church fathers, again, which could be used, and we could more than once over reconstruct the entire New Testament just from the quotes that are written in the early church fathers. So we actually have an embarrassingly high amount of data And very importantly, we also have very, very early attestation here. We're talking about literally within the 1st century, which is very unlike, as we'll see in a moment, the most of the other data that we have that of how we know that all early Roman Caesars existed, of Greek philosophers, of Roman historians. We some of them, we have only one document, and largely most of them are 500 to even up to 900 years after the fact. So the New Testament is entirely unique in this respect. So, the early other documents that we have, that we build our commonly known early history on, most of these range from 500 to 900 years after the fact. And this quote from Bart Ehrman, I think, says quite a lot. He, by the way, is an agnostic scholar who, he's an expert, but he's not a Christian as such. And yet, even he, who is an agnostic, agrees that the New Testament in this regard is unique. So we're now going to look at some other evidence that I did mention that book early on, the undesigned coincidences. So imagine if you wake up one morning and you have one mosquito bite. That's really unpleasant, but you're not going to die. But if you woke up one morning and you had 1,000 mosquito bites, chances are you probably wouldn't survive it. And so it is with these little undesigned coincidences that I will explain in a moment, that if there was just one of them, that would lend a little bit of credibility, but no one would think too much about it. But the New Testament Gospels and the book of Acts, particularly, because these are the sort of narrative style records that we have, they are filled with these undesigned coincidences that lend credibility. So an undesigned coincidence is basically, consider it like this: an account of an event leaves out a bit of information, and that information is filled in quite incidentally by a different account, and it helps to answer some natural questions raised in the first account. So, and if you think of a trial lawyer or a trial situation where you have various different witnesses to a murder account, a murder situation, if all of the witnesses say precisely the same thing, usually it is commonly accepted that means that they are, premeditated. They've compared their stories together, and it's a setup, because that's not how humans see things. We all see things slightly differently, and therefore we will tell a story slightly differently. So a truthful story, you will never get two witnesses say the same thing about a particular event. And so people who research this kind of thing can relatively easily figure out which event is based on a truthful account and which one is not. And the New Testament has many of these undesigned coincidences. So, as I said, to explain, maybe if I just give a simple example. So imagine you have three friends. You've got Alan, Betty, and Carl. Alan and Betty come to you, both telling you something about Carl. And Carl has met them, and he told them in confidence that he's committed fraud. He embezzled funds from your organization. You're all employees of this organization. Alan and Betty say he admitted all this at a conversation with them at a coffee shop where they met recently. Carl, however, independently says to you, "Oh, that's all made up. They're framing me. The conversation at the cafe never happened. It never happened." So you are now in the conundrum to figure out, well, who's telling the truth? So you decide to sit down with Alan and Betty independently to hear their stories. So you sit down with Alan first. He tells you that the coffee shop was terribly crowded. They almost couldn't find a place to sit. And then he goes on and relates all the details of the conversation. Then you sit down separately, independently with Betty, and you ask her, so how did it all, how did it happen? How did this all go? And she says, well, we go there, and strangely enough, Carl was relating the story. Carl knocked over his coffee cup, and it spilled right into my lap. And then she goes on to explain the conversation. And so you think about how those two stories fit together. And of course, the extremely crowded, almost no place to sit, one knocked coffee into the lap of another. These stories fit together, and they fit together in ways that are not designed in a sense that somebody didn't go out of their way to design that story so that you would be fooled into believing it. And so generally, it's an accepted norm that when people lie, they give lots of unnecessary details. And when people collaborate, they give the same details. Whereas in this case, the two pieces of information are casually added, and that's sort of what we would then call an undesigned coincidence. In other words, they independently validate each other, and they validate the truth of the account that they're giving. So we're going to look at two examples of that in the New Testament. One internal and one external. And then you will see as we relate through them. So this first one from John chapter 2 is Jesus mentioning this. The Jews have just asked him, what sign are you going to do for us? The typical thing that the Jews were frequently telling Jesus. We're talking about the Pharisees here. And Jesus tells them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And of course, they completely misunderstand what Jesus is talking about. And as the story goes on, they then say, well, it's taken 46 years, and so on. But of course, they didn't recognize that he was speaking about the temple of his body. And when Jesus eventually was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered the story, and of course, then they believed it. Now, in Mark, the account goes something like this. Now, the chief priests and the whole council were seeking testimony against him. This is at the trial. They were seeking testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. For many bore false witness against him, but their testimony did not agree. And some stood up and bore false witness against him, saying, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands. Yet even about this, their testimony did not agree. So notice, of course, if you just had Mark or you just had John, you would only have two different versions of the story. But the important thing here is that the false witnesses described by Mark misrepresent what Jesus had said, but you wouldn't know that with Mark unless you had the account from John. Jesus had not said that he would not destroy any man-made temple. Rather, he had used the temple as a metaphor for his body. And there's a parallel for this in Matthew 26. Now, if we move forward to Mark 15, and you'll see there, with him they crucified two robbers, one on his right and one on his left. And those who passed him derided him, wagging their heads, saying, aha, you would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Save yourself and come down from the cross. And notice that neither Matthew or Mark give us the original context with regard to what Jesus had originally said. They just say these words. All we are given is the later misrepresentations by the false witnesses and mockers at Jesus' trial and execution. But notice that equally John, the non-synoptic gospel, while reporting Jesus' original words, he does not report on the later misrepresentations at Jesus' trial. So both are giving a truthful account, and they internally, of course, when you piece these two accounts together, you get the full picture. But the point is that they corroborate the same story. And this one here is a very interesting example. So this is a bit of an external evidence in terms of giving you historical information that you would generally just read over and not recognize, but it adds credibility to the story. So here we have Jesus has just fed the 5,000, well, he's about to, sorry, and this is the Passover is at hand. This is in John chapter 6, and Jesus says to Philip, where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat? And he did this to test him and so on. But the reason I've highlighted the name Philip there is important. And that Philip is a fairly minor character in the New Testament. He doesn't really appear often at all. I think this is virtually the only situation where Philip is mentioned. And naturally, we would be inclined to wonder why Jesus hadn't turned to someone a little higher in the pecking order, such as Peter or John. And a partial clue is provided in John 1:44, where we read, Philip, like Andrew and Peter, was from the town of Bethsaida. What's so significant about Philip being from the town of Bethsaida? We don't learn this until we read the parallel account in Luke's Gospel in chapter 9, verse 10 to 17, and particularly we're going to look at verses 10 and 11. On their return, the apostles told them what they had done. This is in Luke's Gospel. And he took them and withdrew apart to a town called Bethsaida. When the crowds learned it, they followed him and welcomed them and spoke to them of the kingdom of God and cured those who had need of healing. So here we are informed by Luke that the event was actually taking place in Bethsaida, the town from which Philip was born. And that's the reason why we read in John that Jesus turns to Philip, whom he believed, of course, would be familiar with the area. Notice also that Luke does not tell us that Jesus turned to Philip. So Luke's not giving us that detail. John did. What makes this even more intriguing is the parallel account in Mark's Gospel, which is in Mark 6:30 to 42, and we're going to have a look at verse 30 and 31. The apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. And they said to him, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And the question, of course, that would arise here, if you just read this account, is why were there many coming and going? Mark doesn't tell us. And here the answer lies in John's account, because in John chapter 6, that passage that we looked at earlier, it explains that the Jewish Passover was near. And so you see that these accounts each give little bits of information that confirm the account in the other one, that lend to the credibility of the total picture. And so they're not deliberately giving you the precisely same story, but they're giving you bits of information that corroborate that the total story is true. So you might ask, well, so what? You know, the occurrence of a multiple undesigned coincidences among these documents, it supports that the conclusion that they are historically reliable. And that's the important point here, is that Jesus nowhere in the New Testament tells us that we should have blind faith. Jesus frequently uses factual information and miracles and various different things to attest to the veracity of the statements that he makes. And so this information should help us be confident in the New Testament as a historical document. And importantly here is that we understand, therefore, that the authors that are relating these stories, as in the authors that wrote the Gospels and the book of Acts, that they are actually truthfully attempting to tell us what they knew. I've linked there in the bottom, and we'll link that to the YouTube link, an interview with Lydia McGree, who actually wrote one of these books. And, you know, for more information, it's fascinating to watch. So where should this take us? Do we need to have exhaustive information about something to be able to do something? And the answer is no. If you think about launching a rocket into space, so imagine when we launched the first man to the moon, we had less computing power than you probably hold in your mobile phone today. And yet we were able with that to send somebody to the moon. So we do not have exhaustive knowledge of space, time, and matter. And yet we can do these kind of crazy things. So, of course, the better knowledge of physics that we have, the more likely we'll succeed. And that's probably also the reason why it's good that we are continually revising and correcting the New Testament documents that we have, based on the fact that we found more early attesting documents that help us tweak minor changes. So do we have exhaustive knowledge of God? And the answer is no. What we do have is sufficient knowledge of God to be confident in the gospel. And that's the important bit. Only the originals are inerrant. I know there's some cultish organizations who will sort of go out and say that, you know, a translation is inerrant. Well, that's definitely not what the greater majority of Christians believe. And if you want to follow up on that, I think Google the Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy. It's a 20-page document that most evangelical churches signed up to in the 80s or 90s. It's a great way of looking at what does biblical inerrancy actually mean. And so what we have 99.9% something percent accuracy in the New Testament, which is sufficient for us to know that what we have are God's words for us. And that's the important thing. And it is important to understand that God used fallible human beings. He could have just dropped the Bible out of the sky and said, there you have it. But he didn't. He chose human beings to do his work, as he has always done, if you look at the Bible from start to finish. And, you know, I've added that little comment at the end. It's a Reformation principle that Luther coined, ad fontes. It just means always go back to the source. So in summary, we see that there are some valid objections, but we do have good answers for these objections. And so the New Testament is the most attested and validated book of antiquity. And the Greek manuscripts underlying the modern translations of the text that we have, and that's not to say that the King James Bible isn't a good translation. That by all means, I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that the modern translations are slightly better in that sense, because they're just being able to be updated with more information. And these are by all means not an exhaustive list of modern translations. They're just examples. But they are based on a good and rock-solid foundation. And importantly, that none of the foundational Christian doctrines, such as the deity of Christ, the incarnation, the birth, death, and resurrection of Jesus, the fact that we are saved by faith alone, through grace alone, the cardinal foundational doctrines of the Christian faith, and that's by all means not an exhaustive list. None of these foundational Christian doctrines has ever been under attack in this regard. So we can rest assured that what we have is indeed the Word of God. Now, I'm going to give you a final observation. It comes from a mathematics professor at Oxford University, John Lennox. I think it's quite pertinent. Observations about the text of the New Testament do not prove that what the documents say is true, of course, but what they do establish are the credentials of the narratives about Jesus as authentic, historical documents which need to be taken seriously. To dismiss them as fabrications not worth our time or attention would be to fail to follow where the evidence leads. It is vital to grasp hold of the credentials of the documents upon which Christianity is based. So in summary, he's basically saying it would be rather foolish not to follow where the evidence leads. Rather, it's the smart thing to do is to follow that evidence and to recognize the validity of the New Testament documents. And in other words, we can rest assured that we're standing on a solid rock.